The entryway has always had a soft spot in my heart, and I see it as the first impression visitors have into my life, giving a glimpse into my personality. And unfortunately, this table doesn't represent me anymore, not to mention it has this annoying habit of doing this. This table I'm about to build is technically a slab table, but a skinny slab. I had picked up these two boards for a previous project, but they were a little too nice to be cut up and turned into cabinet doors, or so I thought. But I didn't realize one of these boards was mostly sapwood, so back in the pile it goes, which poses a problem as I plan to use these two boards for the entire project. But that's future Keaton's problem. Present Keaton has a different problem. Now, I prefer circular saws for breaking down rough lumber, but as tension in the board is released, the wood can move in unpredictable ways, requiring a tool change to finish the job. While I deal with these knots and finish breaking down my rough boards, I should probably tell you about this project. It's going to be an entry table, and like I mentioned, I designed it to represent me. I was tired of walking in and seeing the same old hand-me-down table, and I wanted an upgrade that would bring me joy every time I walked in my home. And I wish I could show you a picture of this design, but honestly, I didn't make one. All I did was write down a few requirements, one of which was to use the lumber I had on hand. And just because I didn't create a plan doesn't mean a lot of thought didn't go into this project. In fact, I feel like I overthought it, which is why the theme of this build is dualities. But more on that later. For now, it's milling time, which is typically done with a joiner and a planer, but I only have one of those, so it has to serve two purposes. But I still have to find a way to joint one edge, and for that, I got a new tool. Well, an old tool. These hand planes were sent to me by Dagmar and Bernard, who inherited them from Dagmar's father, a master carpenter and furniture maker in Germany, who first started using these planes in the 1950s. Dagmar is double kind. When she got these planes home, she knew they had a purpose and they needed to be used. Luckily, she recently started a company where she helps people repurpose and rehome their beautiful things. Typically, unwanted or unused items have two options. They can head to the donation box or the landfill. But someone, somewhere, would appreciate these things, and that's where Dagmar comes in. She connects people who have too much of a good thing with those in need, allowing those objects to be passed on to new owners to get a second chance. I see these planes as more than a tool. They're an embodiment of her dad and his work, living on and continuing to create. Oh, and Dagmar's company is called Double Kindness. There's a link in the description if you have treasures in need of a new home, or if you're out there searching. Earlier, I mentioned duality, a balance between ordinary and complex. This table is going to be plain and function forward, to the eye at least, but under the surface, each of the parts serve multiple purposes. And that's where mortise and tenon comes in. And if you've never used them, you may not know the dual purpose of this joint. The first is inserting opposing grain from the apron into the leg to strengthen the joint, but the second, and equally as important role, is to keep the leg straight. Now what you're seeing me do is create a template. Like a jig, templates help make parts consistent, and consistency is the essence of quality. Or quality can't be achieved without consistency, maybe? I don't know. The point is, templates make it easy to replicate parts, and in this case I needed 4 identical legs in length and in curvature. After cutting each leg to length, I'm going to set up a table saw sled, and I can't help but notice how my mind has shifted. When I was a newer woodworker, I always thought that I needed a jig to be fancy and modular and do all sorts of different things. But then I realized that making a complicated multifunction jig just meant I was spending more time building tools than I was doing what I wanted, which was to make furniture. So when it comes to this whole idea of dual function, I recommend that you keep your jigs as simple as possible. Single function is all they need to do, And then you can always modify that jig for your next project. But now it's time to use this template for its final act, to help me cut the curves on these legs. By double-sided taping the template to the workpiece, I can use the router with the template bit to establish the curve. And then I'll head over to the router table with a flush trim bit to remove the rest of the material so I can do the same thing on all of the other legs until I was routering away and I realized that I cut this curve on the wrong side. Should have been on this side. So I'm going to have to plug the mortise, cut a new mortise on this side, which is going to be tricky because now it is curved and it is tapered. Mistakes, they happen. And it's usually when you're working too fast or not paying close enough attention, which were the two causes for this one. Luckily, the fix was simple. Put a patch in, trim it down, and then take one of those offcuts from tapering earlier and use that to flatten the board back out so it could be remortised. And I was lucky on this one because the patch will be hidden behind the drawer, so you'll never even know that it ever happened. But now it's time to move on, and I have one thing I need to do before I can start cutting tenons, which is to address how the aprons will attach to the tabletop. There are easy ways to do this, like using Z-clips, but those only do one thing. They keep the top from falling off, but a sliding dovetail will serve two purposes: to attach the base to the top and to keep the top flat. And that dual functionality means I can rest easy knowing I did everything I could to make this table last a lifetime. The funny thing about these stretchers is the sliding dovetails were actually the easy part. The hard part is cutting the tenons to fit the mortise, while the apron wraps around the curve of the leg. Luckily, I had the aid of a template, which I created based on my previous template, but with the opposite side of the curve. And with the aid of the router, I had the tenons roughed out, but the rest of the fitment had to be done by hand, which I'll admit, it does take a lot of time, but it sure is satisfying when everything's done. And my advice, if you want to get into hand-cut joinery like this, well, just take it easy. Be patient. Don't get frustrated or try to rush any of the steps. It's those moments where you want to speed things along that you'll accidentally take too much material, and a mistake here will compound itself, giving you a massive headache later. With the legs inside Aprons fit, I need to add a detail before moving on. This design called for the leg to be recessed into the underside of the table, so I'm cutting these little pockets in by hand, attempting to match the curves of the legs as closely as I can. Now that the legs are properly seated, I can take final measurements for the back, but without actually measuring anything. At this point, I'm relying solely on referential measurements, putting pieces in place and marking where the cuts need to be, which is the most accurate way to do it. As you're experiencing this build with me, I want you to notice something. Not what I'm doing, but how and where. I don't have the fanciest tools or the biggest space, but I make it work. Over the years, this little shop of mine has transformed from garage to wood shop. Well, half of it at least, but that hasn't limited me from building furniture I'm proud of. So no matter what your shop looks like or what tools you have, get out there and make. Oh, and my favorite tool is probably this old rusty chisel that was passed down from my wife's grandpa. So leave me a comment down below and tell me what your favorite tool is. Now it's time for the drawer dividers, which will be connected via mortise and tenon to the back piece. I was planning on using the router table to cut these mortises, but for some reason it did not cut straight at all. So I had to clean this one up and make it work, but since I didn't want to spend the time doing this twice, I decided to use dowels for the second one. Now, I'm not a fan of dowels, and they always seem to give me grief, and today was no different, but more on that later. This marks the last piece of the construction for this table, and it's time to start pre-sanding before I can assemble. And I know sanding gets a bad rap, given how boring it can be, but I find if I break sanding up and do it throughout the project in little pieces, then it's not so bad. Plus, it's always fun to see these saw marks just melt away. To assemble, I use a little bit of glue to keep the sliding dovetails tight, but only on one end. That way, the top can expand and contract with seasonal wood movement, and the rest of the pieces just start to fall into place. Now here's the problem I mentioned earlier. This divider was not sitting square because of those darn dowels, which were throwing everything off. And when I saw this, I was really nervous that my drawers were not going to slide correctly and I was going to have to do some weird shimming to get it all to work. But after clamping, it pulled the divider into close enough alignment to avoid an issue. Up to this point, I've been recycling skills learned in previous projects, but now it's time for a challenge. Every project is an opportunity to learn a new skill, and for me, it's these drawers. Not that I haven't made drawers, but never without drawer slides. But this classy piece needs more curves to tie everything together, so I'm mimicking the curved leg detail in the drawer. And to do this, I'm going to remove most of the material from the drawer box with the dado stack, but leaving ½ an inch on each end. And then over at the router table, I'm using 2 bits for this operation, a cove for the drawer slide and a matching radius roundover for the rails. And as I cut these, notice how the extra material helps support the workpiece as it goes through the bit. With those done, I'll switch to a bigger roundover to give the insides of the drawer box a nice, pleasing curve. While I continue the drawer box joinery, let me tell you why I picked this particular challenge. It was a little bit ago I watched a video by Sean Boyd and then another by Chris Salamone at 4 Eyes, where they announced the Rockler Try That Challenge. That announcement and watching them challenge themselves gave me the reason I needed to try something I've never done before, and a project that frankly intimidated me. I mentioned early on that I overthought this project, and this is why. I spent many nights fretting over how I would go about making these drawers, but once I started working, it just made sense and turned out to be a lot easier than I thought. So there's my lesson in this one, to just try, and you'll be able to accomplish more than you ever thought that you could. Now the drawers themselves are one part of this box, but the other is the rails they will ride on. So I'm using some offcuts from earlier and resawing them. And a little trick here, I wasn't certain I had the saw set right in the exact center, so I kissed the blade and then flipped the piece over and tried it the other way. And since the kerf landed in the same spot, it meant that the setup was the exact center of the board. But with those boards resawed, I could use that matching roundover bit from earlier to finish them off. And after adding some blocks to let the drawers clear the leg, these rails were ready for install, which was easy because I used the side of the drawer and a spacer to set the height of the slide, which I temporarily secured in place with super glue and came back to reinforce with some screws. The final part of these boxes is the front and back, which I could now cut because everything is mocked up, and once again, I used referential measurements to determine their final size. As I cut these, I erred on the side of a little bit too long, so here's an old carpenter's trick to sneak up on that fit. A miter saw's blade has the teeth slightly outside the body, so by butting the workpiece up against the blade, you can trim a tiny amount at a time until the pieces fit just right. And because I always seem to struggle with cutting drawer bottoms to the correct size, here's a trick. Since my rabbets and the groove were cut using the same saw blade height, the front of the drawer can be used to set the fence for a perfect bottom fit. At this point, you might be wondering something. Since this detail will only be seen when one of the drawers is opened, which honestly won't be very often, why am I going through all this effort? And it comes back to the very beginning of this video. This table is my first impression. A first impression on my guests, a first impression as I come down the stairs in the morning, and a first impression every time I come home. It sets the mood and a standard for myself. This is a simple table, and it has some hidden detail showing off the work and the craftsmanship that I put into it, and it was also a challenge. My goal for every project is to outdo my last, and I'll admit, this is going to be a hard one to top. But that was the whole point, because if I've pushed myself now, I'm setting myself up to be pushed in the future, especially since I walk by this table every day, and it will remind me to push harder and always strive to make a good first impression. And since this might be my first impression I'm making on you, I'd love to hear what you think so far. To make it easy, we'll do a poll. If you're liking it, hit the like button. If you're loving it, hit that subscribe button. And if you're hating it, well, I guess give me a thumbs down and tell me why in the comments why you've stuck around this far into the video. And for everyone else, let me know in the comments what impression this table leaves on you. And feel free to wait until the end of the video since you haven't seen the whole thing come together yet. We are getting close to the end, with these drawer fronts being the final piece, which I saved some nicely figured walnut for. I cut these the same way as I did for the other 3 aprons, except those tenons I didn't need, so I trimmed them off completely with a flex trim bit. The final step is to cut them apart. Now, when you're using a miter saw, and if you want to try to avoid as much tear out as possible, and I guess if you have a sliding miter saw like this one, I find it yields a better result and it cuts a lot cleaner if you start the saw off of the piece and then you drag it through the workpiece instead of chopping straight down. With that, all my parts are ready and I can start preparing for finish, which starts with filling cracks and holes, which I prefer to do with super glue and accelerator spray because it works really fast. Since this project is all about the small details, I'm adding a cove to the back side of the drawers to create a nice spot to put your fingers when you want to pull these drawers out. And the final detail is to round over the legs to integrate the top and the legs together and remove those sharp, painful corners before I start sanding and finishing. But while I do that, I want to share the real reason why I'm making this project. To be honest, I don't need a new entry table, but I do need a fresh start. I'm calling this new table an entry desk, even though technically it isn't a desk, but it is replacing one. This one. And it's been with me since the beginning of my career, a time when I poured effort into the American dream, working hard, getting ahead, and climbing that never-ending ladder. Then one day I was reviewing my retirement and dreaming about when I could stop doing what I did every day. And I questioned myself. Why? Why was I putting myself through all of this pain to get to the point in my life where I could finally spend my time doing what I wanted? It seemed so silly, so I figured, why not try to do that now? And that's when I started this dual life, managing by day and building by night. My path was split in two. This heavily trafficked, safe trail on one side, but a new, scarier path full of uncertainty on the other. And down that path was also a hint of ever-growing excitement with each step. This table is a conscious effort by me to remove the relics of the past and replace them with a new symbol. Outwardly simple, with layers of complexity lying just beneath the surface. A reminder that the little moments and minor details matter the most. A first impression only happens once, but a new impression comes every day. So put your best foot forward and don't be afraid to let people see a glimpse past that reserved exterior into the beauty that lies within.